right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Chapter 21, The New Deal, 1932 to 1940. Here we see a very gleeful Franklin Roosevelt about to enter office, and the outgoing president, Herbert Hoover, leaving. And now it's Roosevelt's problem. How do we settle this horrible depression that has crippled the United States and Europe and Japan as well? So, Roosevelt comes up with the New Deal, and there's two New Deals. The first one obviously begins right when he takes office. A little background on Franklin Roosevelt, fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a Harvard grad, assistant secretary of the Navy, just like his cousin. Ran for the vice presidency in 1920, but lost to Harding. Governor of New York in 1928, and prior to that, at the age of 39, contracted polio and lost the use of his legs, but never allowed that to stop him, and was able to achieve amazing things as president. Election of 1932, Roosevelt promised a New Deal for the people. The idea that every man has a right to make a comfortable living in this country. And Roosevelt's going to defeat Hoover resoundingly with a 57% of the vote garnered. And Roosevelt will go on to win 4 elections, which today, because of the 22nd Amendment, will always be a record. Here is the electoral votes between Roosevelt and Hoover. Hoover carrying just a few states. Connecticut, surprisingly. So, first New Deal. This is the world's responses to the Depression. In Britain and France, they had conservative governments not meeting the needs of the people. Italy, Germany, the Soviet Union turned to brutal dictatorships. Japan had a military government, which was also equally brutal. Roosevelt believed his New Deal was an alternative to socialism, alternative to fascism, and to unregulated capitalism that had not been working for the nation. A very famous line from his inauguration: "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." So Roosevelt had the idea: try a whole bunch of programs, and if it works, stick with it. If it doesn't work, move on to the next one. And the biggest problem was the banking crisis. In his first week in office, Roosevelt had all of the banks in the country temporarily closed. Thousands had already failed previously. About a third of the nation's banks had already closed down completely. And the Emergency Banking Act will be passed, which will provide funds to the banks so they can reopen. The Glass-Steagall Act barred banks from buying stocks, a terrible practice in the 1920s, contributing to the Depression, and established the FDIC, which will insure the accounts of depositors. Very common thing was a run on a bank where crowds of people will wait in line until the bank literally runs out of money, then the bank is closed forever. The FDIC can alleviate this problem. The first 100 days of FDR's term, he passed a series of laws in these 3 months. Law after law after law, all with like the alphabet soup of names, the CCC and the AAA, and we'll get to all of those. The National Industrial Recovery Act will establish the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which will set codes with business leaders for output and prices, to set working conditions for the workers, and also to recognize the workers' rights to unions. So finally, we're going to see the government behind the rights of the workers to unionize, and that's going to last into modern times. There's Roosevelt delivering one of his very famous fireside chats. 2/3 of Americans had radios, and that was Roosevelt's way of communicating with the populace, talk in a calm, soothing manner so that he can reach out to the nation. Here's a bunch of those programs that we talked about. PWA, the Public Works Administration, allocated billions for roads and schools and hospitals. The CWA employed 4 million people, again, constructing highways and tunnels, courthouses, airports, things like that. The Tennessee Valley Authority is going to provide cheap electricity to, obviously, the Tennessee area, which was extremely poor at the time. Built dams to prevent floods. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, here's an example of a New Deal program that ultimately didn't work, but it's going to raise farm prices and incomes. Doesn't help out all farmers. It's going to reduce the amount of farm products available and livestock. A lot of criticism because millions of pigs were slaughtered, yet the pigs were not distributed for people to eat around the country, and lots of tenant farmers and sharecroppers will be evicted from their lands as the need for more farming decreases to try to get those prices up. And coinciding with the farmers' problems was the Dust Bowl, the most severe drought in history. Um, Here's the sharecroppers leaving their farms, but the Dust Bowl encompassed all of these areas here on the map and other areas as well throughout the Midwest where very difficult to grow food. The topsoil had been overused and it's going to blow away after the severe drought. Giant dust storm coming into Kansas. You better find cover. And there were even instances where they dirt traveled from Kansas all the way to the East Coast, Boston, Washington D.C. The Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration are going to insure millions of long-term mortgages. They're going to build thousands of units of low-rent housing. So the whole American dream idea where people can have their own home and have a sense of true liberty. Dreams will be coming true with these acts. The Supreme Court and the New Deal. The court is going to be overwhelmingly Republican during the first New Deal, opposite of Roosevelt's party. And they're going to kill the AAA, saying it's unconstitutional use of congressional power. And the NRA will also be struck down because it gave the president legislative powers, which they are not supposed to have. There were voices of protest. Not everybody supported Roosevelt, especially the rich. And the rich wouldn't like this one either. Huey Long's Share Our Wealth program, and his plan was to confiscate the wealth of the richest Americans and give everybody $5,000 and a job, which today's money, that's like 90 grand. Father Coughlin had a radio show critical of bankers and capitalists. He called for the government ownership of key industries. And Dr. Francis Townsend had a plan to support the elderly, as he was old, where the elderly are given $200 a month, and the rule was you have to spend the whole thing, and that would help stimulate the economy. So even though these men never defeated Roosevelt, a lot of their ideas will be noted and somewhat, to some degree, implemented in the second New Deal. There's a portrait of Huey Long, known as the Kingfish of Louisiana politics. He was assassinated in 1935, a year before he had hoped to run for president. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, hired 3 million Americans each year, all the way until 1943. They've built thousands of public buildings, bridges, roads, airports, stadiums. It goes on and on. So again, just trying to get people jobs and help them get through this horrible depression. In 1932, 25% of Americans were unemployed, and you can double that for African Americans. The all-important Wagner Act is going to protect employees for union representation, and it made it illegal to blacklist and fire union organizers. Here's a panel depicting the construction of a dam, 1939. Like the artists were a big part of the New Deal as well. Still have it today, the Social Security Act. This is going to establish a system of unemployment insurance, old age pensions, aid to the disabled and elderly, the poor, and families with children. So the American people pay into Social Security. Money comes out of their weekly paychecks and goes into Social Security, and then the government can use it to aid its citizens. And then once people retire, they would receive a pension for the rest of their lives. So, crowning achievement of the New Deal, and something that's still an important part of America today. Unfortunately, did not reach all people. The original bill incorporated a system of national health insurance, but the doctors didn't like that because it could set their wages at a certain rate. And many Americans were excluded from Social Security on purpose, particularly blacks. So before the 30s, Americans asked, should the government intervene in the economy? And after the New Deal, the only question is, how much should they be part of the economy. No longer will the question be, are they going to be part of the economy and controlling it? Here's a poster promoting the new Social Security. The court fight. Franklin Roosevelt worried the Supreme Court would invalidate his Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, and other New Deal measures. So he came up with a plan. Any Supreme Court justice over the age of 70, and there were a few, Roosevelt believed he should be allowed to add another member to the Supreme Court. People said this is abusing the rules. They criticized him as if he was an aspiring dictator. But it's something that he wanted to do to keep his New Deal intact. John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, offered a shift from the balanced budget idea that many economists supported to a massive government spending program. So even if you're in a deficit, the idea is if you're in a depression or recession to spend, and that will keep up that purchasing power and stimulate economic activity. And that's something we've seen today in the last 10 years. Our government is incurring massive debt, but it's keeping people aloft. So it remains to be seen if it's the right call, but it's a tough one. So the illegal act, a cartoon critical of the Supreme Court. We see the Depression is the water, and Mr. Roosevelt in the boat. All right, unemployment. The unemployment rate peaked in 1932 at 25%. If you scroll down to 1942, 41, that's when World War II began for the United States, and unemployment was very, very low. World War II is going to end the Great Depression, not the New Deal. And we can see a recession will spike in 1937, and unemployment, which had dropped from 25 down to 15%, was back up to 20%. Good unemployment is considered to be like 4 or 5%. You really want to keep numbers around that area. You don't want to have it numbers like this. It's just crippling to a country. Problem for Roosevelt was the South. A lot of the key leadership positions in Congress were held by Southerners, and Roosevelt believed he could not challenge them on any civil rights if he wanted their support. So segregation will continue throughout the Roosevelt years and into the 1950s and 60s. And because of the denial of Social Security, many blacks were discriminated upon again and again and again, and had to rely on government handouts. And because they were not paying into Social Security, a stigma developed which associated blacks with laziness. Obviously not true and not fair, but that was what happened in this time in the 1930s. The 30s were the heyday of American communism, and ironically, the communists who support Joseph Stalin and the spread of communism worldwide are going to help reshape the boundaries of American freedom. So there was a growing appeal to communism. Many people believe capitalism had failed, and communism, because they participated in so many events to help workers and unions and support the unemployed and supported civil rights. Many people found sympathy with this group. The end of the New Deal. As the end of the 1930s approached, Southern Democrats' support lessened. They feared federal intervention in their region. They wanted to keep control, especially over the African Americans. Republicans started gaining seats in Congress, and a lot of these popular New Deal programs will be brought to an end. And Roosevelt himself was a little more preoccupied with Hitler in 1939, started taking over various countries throughout Europe. His attention was towards World War II and would the United States enter. The New Deal in American history. The federal government was now an active force, and it always has been since the New Deal and continues to be. Faith in democracy was restored. It didn't improve race relations or end the Depression, but the accomplishments were truly remarkable. So we will continue talking about Roosevelt and World War II, but this includes the New Deal.